Hello, thank you for coming again to our next session of the workshop. Our second session for today is about identifying and discussing opportunities for restoring nutritional landscapes to mitigate habitat loss and improve the value of conservation lands. So we know that improving pasture for grazing livestock is a common strategy that farmers use to increase yields. Can we similarly increase the carrying capacity of landscapes for threatened native folivores while also avoiding risks like overbrowsing? Could restoring degraded habitat with better quality food be a tool for mitigating habitat loss in areas where animals are losing ground to landscape change? Who would use these strategies and how could we upscale them? Are there opportunities for synergies with other reforestation initiatives, such as carbon farming, so we plant the right trees in the right places? These are some of the ideas that will be presented in this session. After each presentation, we'll open the virtual floor to questions and encourage the audience to engage with the material and ideas presented. You can also write questions using the chat function, and we'll try to address as many of these as we can before we have to move on to our next presentation. Our first presenter is Abigail Wills, who is the State Manager of Environmental Services at Envite Environment. Abby unfortunately was not able to attend in person today, so her colleague Matt Kennedy will be joining us to answer any questions following her pre-recorded presentation. Matthew is the Environmental Projects Coordinator at Envite Environment. I'll introduce Matt properly in our third session today, as he'll be speaking himself in that session. Both Matt and Abby have experience in implementing transformative landscape restoration projects that merge science and practice in new and exciting ways to achieve great conservation outcomes. I'm so pleased to be working with them on the project that we'll be discussing in our third session as well. And now for our first presentation from Abigail Wills.
Hello, my name's Abby and I work for a not-for-profit called Envite Environment, and I'm going to talk to you about opportunities for restoring nutritional landscapes to mitigate habitat loss and to improve the value of conservation lands. Now, to do that, I'll first provide a bit of a background into Envite, who we are, what we do, and how we got to be involved with this initiative. And then I'll go on to discuss some of the key considerations that we're exploring in terms of broader application of the nutritional landscapes approach and how it can be applied to restore landscapes at scale, not only for wildlife, but also for people and for communities too. So Envite's an environmental not-for-profit, and we've got offices with teams operating all along Australia's east coast, including from Queensland to northern New South Wales, right down to East Gippsland in eastern Victoria, where I'm based. So we run a variety of government and other grant-funded initiatives focused around ecological restoration, but then also on employment and skills development as well. So providing opportunities for people in the communities where we work to get stuck in and get involved working with nature. In tandem, we run a number of fee-for-service crews, which provide a really fantastic opportunity for us to apply what we know in the industry, and then also as an avenue for ongoing employment for people in the community who are engaged through our traineeship programs and also through economic stimulus programs as well. So one of the key areas of work that we're involved in, especially through our teams in New South Wales, is koala habitat restoration. So we run 2 local nurseries where we propagate and grow good quality koala food trees for planting out in the community. And alongside key partners, we're also working to protect and restore koala habitat in strategic locations identified as areas of regional koala significance. So we do that by engaging with private landowners and supporting them to establish conservation agreements, which include financial and other incentives, as we're able to provide technical and hands-on support to manage the areas that they set aside for conservation. So as you can see in the map there, the green areas are private properties that we're supporting to restore koala habitat. And then the blue areas are the existing protected area network. So the work that we're doing is actually having a, well, multiple benefits, but a really fantastic contribution towards creating or improving connectivity between existing protected areas, and then also restoring the overall area of habitat accessible to koalas. Under that particular project in Bungarwalbin, we're on track to restore and protect over 500 hectares of koala habitat in just 3 years. So similarly, early this year, we partnered with the Australian National University on an initiative to restore nutritional landscapes for greater gliders in East Gippsland. Now, Cara Youngentop of ANU provides an overview in her keynote speech of the nutritional landscape's ecology. So I won't go into any great detail for the purpose of this presentation, but I will just outline a number of key bits of information that you need to know for context. So the first thing is that not all eucalypt tree species are equally as tasty or palatable for folivores, such as greater gliders and koalas. So they actually have different levels of chemical compounds, and some species, so a really good example in the East Gippsland region is silvertop ash, is actually unpalatable, so they just can't eat it. And in the case of silvertop, it actually happens to be a species that proliferates really well post-disturbance, so for instance logging and fire in the region, which means that what we find when we see broad forested landscapes, if they happen to be dominated by silvertop ash and other unpalatable trees, what we see is a contiguous intact ecosystem to a koala or a greater glider might actually look like a fragmented desert. So it's another form of habitat fragmentation that we're talking about here that perhaps isn't as visible to us as people, to the naked eye. And the last key thing is seed sourcing. So seed sourcing is also important. What we find is that due to varying chemical compounds within species as well as between species, and the fact that local fauna tend to have adapted to deal with eating the chemical compounds that are slightly higher or lower in their particular location, in order to restore landscapes that are really of benefit to the local fauna living in a particular area, seed sourcing is important. So we want to look at taking the seed from areas that are known to support some of those source populations. So what we're doing with ANU and East Gippsland in the first instance is actually trialling some of these approaches to really restore the species composition and nutritional quality of disturbed forest areas for greater gliders and broader biodiversity. We're doing that through a combination of thinning silvertop ash, as well as encouraging growth of high quality food trees through a combination of direct seeding and enrichment planting. But my colleague Matt, who's pictured there on the slide, is doing an accompanying presentation on the specific methods. So again, I won't go into too much detail here. If you want to learn more, do make sure that you have a look at his presentation. But what I really want to get us thinking about and talking about are the broader questions of how can we best make use of nutritional landscape science? Where are there synergies with other restoration initiatives? And how, where, and why should we be upscaling the approach? So firstly, I should say that for Envite and for other restoration practitioners, it's essentially a no-brainer. Like, the nutritional landscape science is massively valuable to us, as it ties directly in with the work that we're doing to restore habitat for koalas in northern New South Wales, for example, and the work that we're doing and are planning to do to restore habitat for greater gliders and broader biodiversity in East Gippsland. We can also apply the principles for use in our nurseries, and the same applies for nurseries elsewhere, to ensure that we're growing the highest quality food tree species from areas known to support healthy populations of the threatened species that we're looking to create habitat for. So those are two really valuable ways that we can apply this science to improve the work that we're doing. In addition to the work that we're doing to restore areas of cleared land, there's massive potential for this approach that we see for use by public land managers that perhaps manage national parks, for instance, by ensuring, well, by doing what we can to increase the carrying capacity of the vegetation in those areas, and also, for instance, to restore buffers along waterways to create habitat corridors that are of high nutritionist value and create the right combination of food tree species for animals to pass through the landscape. In addition, so in East Gippsland, a lot of farming, a big farming community, and there's really great potential for the approach to be applied, for instance, in plantings along shelter belts, so that they can provide multiple benefits, not only as shelter for livestock against weather extremes, but also for local biodiversity too. And then, so what about the flip side? So if we can plant trees that are great nutrition to encourage wildlife that we want to encourage, doesn't it stand to reason that we could also plant low quality food trees in areas that we don't want to encourage wildlife? So some examples that spring to mind would be in timber plantations to mitigate wildlife losses during harvesting, for instance, or creation of buffer zones, so planting unpalatable food trees in areas around restoration patches that we want to protect from overbrowsing, for instance. Those are just a couple of ideas. And I wonder whether in applying the approach to improve carrying capacity of forests in wilderness areas, while also increasing productivity of food and fibre on production land, would that result in enhanced capacity for people and wildlife to coincide within landscapes? So in addition to those broader applications, there are a number of synergies of this nutritional landscape science with other restoration approaches that are well worth exploring. So for instance, in response to climate change, increasing attention is being paid to provenance in seed collection for restoration. So ensuring that we're achieving the appropriate balance of genetic diversity that will enable ecosystems to adapt to climatic conditions. And perhaps we also need to include nutrition into these considerations. So ensuring that fauna can migrate through landscapes in response to changing climate and still have a healthy food source on which to feed. Likewise, as carbon offsets, so carbon farming gains traction, restoring native areas of vegetation to sequester carbon and generate marketable carbon offsets. Can we apply nutritional landscapes principles to ensure that the right things are planted in the right places to maximize biodiversity outcomes and co-benefits? So this is a really important point to make, especially in cases where we're planting trees in perpetuity for the primary objective of storing carbon. It stands to reason that we should also be doing everything we can to make sure that these forests provide quality habitat for biodiversity as well. Unfortunately, there's quite a few examples where carbon farmings actually comprise monocultures with little in the way of broader conservation values. And in some cases, these plantings are established or established in areas that actually displace native ecosystems that would have otherwise occurred there. So a really good example is grassland habitats. So there's a growing concern that the uprise of carbon farming, and a valid concern, is resulting in displacement of these ecosystems, which are actually lower in above ground carbon stocks, but actually have massive values for biodiversity in their own right. So I think on that note, it's important to stress that when we're talking about restoring forests, whether it's in the context of restoring nutritional landscapes for folivores or otherwise, we really are talking about, or should be talking about, restoring forests in areas where they traditionally would occur or naturally would occur. I should say. And likewise, looking at the species compositions and the ecological vegetation classes and ensuring that we're keeping those as much as possible. And perhaps the application of the nutritional landscapes principles can help us keep on track in that regard too. And even be applied to restore some other habitats other than forests, like grasslands, for instance, by ensuring that grass food quality is good for local species. So, given the multiple uses of nutritional landscape science and synergies with other approaches, we see huge potential for broader application of the approach, broader application and scaling up of the approach. Now, that could happen on the one hand somewhat organically through mainstreaming nutritional landscapes principles, for example, in decision making by land managers and community involved in species selection for restoration, for instance, and then also in nurseries for seed sourcing, as I mentioned before. Furthermore, as timber harvesting in native forests is phased out, there's massive potential to restore the nutritional quality in habitats that were previously used for production, but are now, as a result, have higher levels of silvertop ash than you would naturally expect to see, and lower levels of these really good quality food tree species that are required to be there for animals and broader biodiversity to return. So that's a mammoth task which has potential to create employment, alternative industry development, for example, fibre from thin silvertop, alternative forest products, ecotourism as we come to restore biodiversity in these areas and look at alternative uses for these forest reserves. But with limited resources, we will need to prioritise sites based on opportunities for restoring nutritional landscapes that have the greatest value for wildlife and people. So we're not going to be able to restore everything, and I think it's really important that we start considering where the priorities lie. And I wonder whether in recognising the multiple potential benefits for restoring nutritional landscapes, whether this will open novel opportunities for partnerships and financing to scale up their approach at a regional and national scales. So on that note, as a closing note, I'll just say that while at Envite, we're pretty good at what we do. We've been doing ecological restoration since 1993. We certainly don't know everything, and we're open to exploring new approaches and partnerships to achieve positive human and environmental outcomes. And we're keen to engage in the conversation. So do get in touch if you have any ideas, and I'd really love to hear about our ideas in terms of how we can best make use of nutritional landscape science, where the synergies are with other restoration initiatives, and how, where, and why we should be upscaling the approach. Thank you.
So I'd like to introduce our second presenter, who's Mark Aitkens. And Mark works at RPS Newcastle in a multidisciplinary consulting company. As a consulting ecologist for 25 years, Mark has used his general flora and fauna skills for projects requiring approval under state and Commonwealth regulatory schemes. Mark has worked on a variety of projects from quarries to highway upgrades, and more recently, the monitoring of endangered fauna and ecological communities for approved state significant development. Where appropriate, Mark seeks to apply contemporary scientific knowledge in the project's approval space, where creative solutions are required to address real-world problems. Mark was introduced to the concept of nutritional landscapes about 3 years ago and has sought to understand and seek ways of integrating the benefits of this science in a large land release project at Port Stephens. And that's what he'll be talking about to you all today.
Hi and good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Aitkens and I'm a consulting ecologist working at RPS in Newcastle. I am here today to talk about how we've used nutritional science in an impact assessment framework. About 3 years ago, I was introduced to Dr. Kara Youngentov and Dr. Karen Marsh. And in the 3 years that have transpired, I've come to learn a lot about nutrition and the importance in the landscape. I've learned about the process involved in quantifying it, and come to understand just how important the variation is between and within species, the effects of plant secondary metabolites on herbivory. I've learned how to map this data and use it. And use it in an impact assessment framework in a number of different ways. The first, most important, is to identify areas for impact avoidance. But other innovative ways have been considered and utilised, such as how we can minimise impacts and how we can develop mitigation measures. And it's the latter that I will spend some time on towards the end of this presentation, where I'll speak about an enrichment program that's proposed at a site here in Port Stephens. So folivores in nutrient poor landscapes are constantly making decisions about where they're going to browse, and those decisions often relate to the nutrition of that browse and the cost associated with obtaining that browse. And for the koala in low nutrient environments, the decisions made are often very important. And unmanaged landscapes typically work against folivores such as the koala. So we can see in unmanaged landscapes that forests become nutritionally degraded, and we know that can result in reduced reproductive success. So changes in fire regimes, whether that be an increase or a decrease in the occurrence of exotic species, that may be plant or animal, the kinds of human land uses and the modifications to forests, and the altered patterns in canopy recruitment. We know also in unmanaged landscapes that patches can become less suitable through a reduction in biomass, and so that would lead to an increasing need to forage further afield, and often that is met with movement costs, as patches are often disconnected or there is tenuous connections, and that can result in physiological stress, which further increases the need to acquire nutritious browse. We have a number of tools that we use in the impact assessment industry, and they've been developed over a number of decades. We often or typically use vegetation types as a habitat surrogate, and erroneously so, may I add. There has been some degree of reliance on soil fertility as a way of understanding habitat importance or value, and I think we're now beginning to learn that that's not so important. Tree size and type alone as a means for understanding browse suitability. Certainly now nutritional data is telling us that the variability is not related necessarily to tree type and size. And the use of activity measures can be quite informative, but also difficult to use when deciding how to identify areas for impact avoidance. And ultimately that kind of information is not that informative in developing mitigation measures. So many assumptions have been made, and those assumptions variously are either unsupported or not particularly useful in aiding in decisions. So I'm going to jump to the site here in the Lower Hunter at Port Stephens, and it's about a 500 hectare site that's mostly vegetated, and it's in a landscape that has been heavily modified. It's got a number of different vegetation types, and we know that koala is present. But we're not really certain what's driving the occurrence of the koala at this site. And this is one of the reasons why nutrition has been used at this site, to better understand how we can appreciate landscape use. The soils are typically derived from the Carboniferous geology, and the soil types are fairly similar. There's some variation, but we do know that salinity is not a factor to consider on this site, and we learned earlier that salinity can be an important consideration in nutrition. The site's also located in the lowlands, and so elevation relief is quite small, and elevation is again not a factor to be considered in this particular site. Now, I mentioned earlier there's a number of different vegetation types, and the diversity of tree species is quite high, and you can see here that on the right listed there's many different trees, and most of those have some role in providing browse for the koala. A couple of examples of the distribution of these trees. This is tallowood. As you can see, it's quite restricted and has a heterogeneous distribution. Another example is grey gum, or Eucalyptus punctata. Again, quite a heterogeneous distribution, as is the distribution for forest red gum. So the patterns across this site aren't immediately apparent and are difficult to understand or appreciate, especially for a species that's reliant, a koala is reliant on browse that is particular and often determined by tree type and the genetics of those trees. Across the site, there's also considerable amount of weed cover. The lantana coverage is quite dense, probably across about 50% of the site. And that's had an adverse effect on the recruitment processes, the canopy recruitment in those parts of the site. There's also wild dog and dingo, and the feral deer is quite abundant as well. And while we're not sure exactly the impact, but I can imagine that recruiting canopy species that are nutritious could very well be eaten by deer. We've used a number of methods to sample koala on site. Typically, spotlighting, we've used the search area technique, koala detection dogs, infrared cameras, song meters, follow nutrients, and we've produced a lot of data. And I must say, just on this note, that my favourite specialists in this project are Taz and Missy from OAD. They have done a sterling job in understanding where koalas occur on site. So here's some quick outputs from the methods that have been applied and the understanding we've gained. So on the left there is a map showing the incidence of koala scats. As you can see, they're broadly distributed throughout the site. We've also got some modelling generated from SAT data in the top right. And in the bottom right, we have relative activity data generated from the dog detection work performed by OAD. So multiple different sources of information and different kinds of information generated, leading to different interpretations. So the complex array of indicators that we've developed from the site have all been considered and used, and what's been uncertain through that process is the meaningfulness of that information in decision making, the temporal nature of it, and whether or not the decisions we make now are of any meaning to the koala in 5, 10, 20 years. So nutrition is an important element of koala ecology, and in the case of the koala in low nutrient landscapes, it's a primary driver, no question. Koalas they select their browse by smell, taste, and how it makes them feel. They can't afford to make poor decisions, and they don't select their browse in a way that we might, which would be morphology of leaf or the bark type or whatever it is, and the tree species that we discern from such characteristics. So we have to understand the forest from a different perspective. And the nutrition analysis done at this site has been through material collected along transects and analysed in the laboratory by ANU. And we've looked at total nitrogen, we've looked at available nitrogen, which is a meaningful measure. We've looked at the herbivory deterrents, the secondary plant metabolites, FPCs, and UBFs. And all that information has been considered in terms of the nutritional value of the landscape that we are assessing. So ANU used 9 transects, and the 9 transects were spatially representative across the site. They were selected after first considering the sampling grid that was used by the dog detection survey. And that dog detection survey is on the right there, bottom right. And it's also been stratified by the extent of the impact footprint. So we've got an area of impact and an area of conservation proposed. And so the transects have had consideration for that. The results obtained are quite informative and consistent too, might I add, with other studies. So yes, there is on site, there is considerable variation between species as expected, and there's also considerable variation within species. And that's a pretty important factor, which we'll touch on a little bit later when it comes to how we've considered impact minimisation. Results by transect, that shows that at a forest level, at a tree cohort level, there is variation. And that's to be expected because the forest components do vary across the site. And the plant secondary metabolites are also quite informative. And here we can see that some species are quite well defended. And on this site, forest red gum and grey box and sun grey gum and white stringy bark are quite well defended. And that's probably because they've been subject to a fair amount of herbivory over time. So the studies that have been performed gave us empirical knowledge on what browse species are important on site. And those are, in descending order of importance, forest red gum, grey gum, small fruited grey gum, grey box and tallowood. Although the latter one, tallowood, might be more important than we think, as there are other characteristics to browsing that might make it more suitable. But we should not ignore the other species, because we know that the koala doesn't make judgments on species alone. There are other reasons why a koala would browse or select something as part of its diet in a foraging context. So I think it's important here that the nutrition science has helped us consider the tree cohort in a way that takes us away from biases or assumptions that certainly have been used in the past to quantify and understand habitat. We've got more facts and evidence about what's important on this site, and that's a particularly important element to the impact assessment process. So nutrition on this site has considered all relevant tree species, the good ones, the not so good ones, and it's considered them all collectively at the forest stand scale. And that's important because that's the context for the koala. So the nutritional results to map required additional steps, and the first step was to sample the entire site to appreciate the tree cohorts spatially. And here we sampled 187 points, and we identified the 30 tree species present at each of those points. From that data, we upscaled the transect nutritional data to the tree cohort data using some statistical means. That was performed by Dr. Robert Clark at ANU. And from there, we then proceeded to fill in the unknown spaces. And we used a kriging method or interpolation to understand the distribution of nutrition across the site. So here's some maps. The maps showing mean available nitrogen, because that's the most meaningful measure of nutrition for the koala after we consider the effects of tannins. And we can see here, as previously indicated from the heterogeneous nature of tree distribution, that the available nitrogen across the site varies. Now the dots there are koala scat observations, and you can see that there is a fairly widespread distribution of koala scats on site, and some occur in areas of a relatively high available nitrogen and others in relatively low. FPCs, which is the most important measure of herbivore deterrent on this site, because koalas here typically use synthiomerts. The FPCs indicate parts of the site that are heavily defended from herbivory, and you'll note in the western half that there is a considerable amount of land that's covered by elevated levels of FPCs. It's also the same area where there's a lot of forest red gum and also grey gum. UBFs measured on site, again, the western half comprises relatively high levels of UBFs, and so these are well defended trees and would cause or disrupt or have an influence on herbivory in those areas. So how have we applied this nutritional data within an impact assessment framework? How have we developed avoidance and minimisation and mitigation outcomes? Well, for avoidance, we use the data to clearly identify areas of elevated nutrient value. And the map shown there, and the hatched area in particular, identifies lands that have been separated from the development footprint, which was approved through a rezoning about 10 years ago. And they were separated because of the value, the nutritional value that occurs in those areas. FPCs were also considered, and while areas that have high FPC values aren't necessarily unsuitable, they're probably a little less unsuitable than proximal areas where FPC levels are slightly lower, certainly where the nutrient levels are higher. And so there was some degree of appreciation of this in determining impact avoidance areas. And again, the UBFs, you can see in the western half, a very large patch of UBFs that would probably deter herbivory. And so in some respects, some of those lands are probably not as suitable for the koala as otherwise would be the case. So this here is a map showing the bellowing activity of males during breeding season, and we used the passive acoustics recording method recently published And here it shows that bellowing activity is quite high in areas of elevated phytonutrients, and to some degree a little less in the poorer parts of the landscape. Not a completely consistent trend there, but certainly comforting to note that bellowing activity is certainly elevated in the impact avoidance areas, and it's also quite elevated in the areas that have been separated from development and then form part of a proposed conservation area. So I'm going to move on to impact minimisation, and the data that was obtained from the site has been particularly informative in identifying what I call super trees. So we know that genetics drives nutrition, and it's those genetics that we've identified through this analysis. So it's those trees that we've identified through this analysis that are going to be important in remedies that will be applied on site, such as revegetation works and also enrichment works, which I'll discuss shortly. So we know where these trees are, and we know their available nitrogen levels, and we know the FPC levels. So forest enrichment. This particular site, we have two different proposed land uses. The land use involving the clearing of habitat is for urban development, and the other land use is for biodiversity conservation. And it's in the biodiversity conservation area that we turn our attention to and look for opportunities for managing the landscape in favour of folivores. So we know that at the forest stand scale, we know that available nitrogen can vary, and we also know that plant secondary metabolites do also. And the canopy composition of such forests can be easily modified. We know this from forestry activities. We know this from post-fire environments. So such knowledge allows us to think that there can also be positive manipulations for the benefit of folivores. And it's in this context that we can consider strategic plantings of the super trees identified from the nutrient analysis, that we can then enrich the forest and do so in a way that benefits the koala. And we know that enrichment works have been performed recently on the New South Wales North Coast, where in a national park there has been an area of land that was identified as having poor nutrition, and in that area there was a concerted effort to plant koala preferred browse, notably swamp mahogany. And following the planting in that forest, there has been an increased amount of koala activity detected. So enriching the phytonutrients, we know it's got a relationship with carrying capacity. Jesse Ower's work has given us insight as to how carrying capacity increases for the koala as a forest's nutritional value increases. And in this particular slide, you can see the transect results from Kings Hill overlaid on Jesse Ower's research work. So the steps involved in nutrient enrichment at this site have been, firstly, to identify an area that's suitable for enrichment. So we're looking for parts of the forest that could benefit from the planting of super trees. We've had to upscale the nutrition transect data to the tree cohort data in the enrichment area using multiple planting density scenarios that attempt to identify, so pretend to quantify the benefit of enrichment plantings. And we know that these super trees exist. They've already been identified on site. And we know that the available nitrogen from these trees is highly suitable. And we also know that the secondary plant metabolites are not going to inhibit herbivory. Through all that work, we found that a 30% enrichment model was the most optimum approach or scenario, and that's what we've used in this enrichment program. So here's the selection process. The management area was identified. You can see in the hatch the conservation area that's to receive this management has areas of lower nutritional value. Whilst still valuable, it's of lower value. And that is the area that enrichment plantings will be performed. And in performing those enrichment plantings, there will be varying prescriptions. Some areas will receive 30 trees per hectare, others 70, and then others again will receive 100 trees per hectare. It's estimated that approximately 10,400 trees will be planted in about a 143 hectare enrichment management area. And this is this state, or the nutritional state of the forest before enrichment plantings. So you can see in the conservation area, there are areas of lower nutritional value, not unsuitable, but lower. And when we apply the enrichment plantings in the management area, we can see a considerable uplift in the value of that forest. And so the kinds of species we're going to be planting in those areas will obviously be relative, so we wouldn't be planting foreign species in there. We'd be using forestry gum where appropriate. But we'd also be using grey gum, which we know from site observations is quite important for the koala. And we'd be using strategic plantings of tallowood, of grey box, and potentially other species such as narrowleaf diamondbark. It all depends on circumstance, but there will be a number of different species used, and of those species we'll be using those with superior genetics that provide high nutrient in the foliage. So as a summary, we know that nutrition is important to the koala. We can use this information to understand impacts and also find ways to avoid impacts. It also plays a critical role in providing confidence in the kinds of impact minimisation and mitigation measures that we can develop for folivores. The studies performed on site helped us identify super trees, and those trees have characteristics that are highly desirable for folivores. And we can use those trees in enrichment plantings and improve the confidence in the outcomes that are expected. Overall, there's also the potential to look at enrichment plantings as a scalable exercise, and can be used in larger forests where they've been degraded by various historical activities, and where benefit might be of importance to the koala. Thank you.
So our final presenter for today is Kirsty Leckie. Kirsty is a service manager for the Environment and Education Unit at the Redland City Council and has had a significant career in working as an environmental scientist for international corporations, managing major conservation projects around the world. Kirsty could not be here in person today, but Catherine Dexter will be participating in this session to answer any questions that you might have after the presentation. Kath and Kirsty have worked together with their team and across council to introduce the concept of major urban greening projects that will restore habitat and create corridor links for wildlife across the city of Redlands. Catherine is an ecologist and conservation biologist with over 15 years experience as a koala researcher and project manager in urban ecology research, with a particular emphasis on koala movement. Kath's current role is with the Redland City Council as the Koala Conservation Project Officer. A key focus for the Redland City Council is to stabilize the Redland Coast koala population by 2027. Catherine is a founding member and current committee member for the Australasian Network of Ecology and Transportation Conferences. I first met Kath while collecting leaf samples at some of her research sites in Southeast Queensland many years ago, and she recently got in touch with me because she is interested in trying to restore the nutritional quality of habitat in the Redlands and to increase the carrying capacity and habitat quality for the koala. We're in very early days of discussing this project and how it could complement her larger koala conservation initiatives in the Redlands, which Kirsty will discuss in her presentation today. And at the very end, she mentioned some of the ideas she has for combining what they're planning to do with hopefully finding ways to restore nutritional landscapes as well. So without further ado, I'll just briefly I apologize, there's some sound quality issues. It is a short presentation only about 11 minutes, and hopefully won't detract too much. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Kirsty Leckie, and today I'll be speaking about building resilience through landscape scale regeneration on Redland's coast and how Redland City Council is building resilience and potential for regeneration in the natural environment and communities. Redland City Council has adopted a number of plans over the last 5 years: the Koala Conservation Strategy, Wildlife Connections Plan, Biosecurity Plan, and most recently the Redlands Coast Bay and Creeks Plan under the Natural Environment Policy. The aim is to protect, restore and build resilience in the natural environment throughout Redlands Coast through a collaborative action-based approach, including ecological restoration, community engagement, acquisitions, environmental offsets and biosecurity surveillance. Council is taking a landscape scale approach to biodiversity and conservation. Why is this so important? Taking a strategic approach and engaging the hearts and minds of the community enables Council and the community to work together to protect and enhance the natural environment and be prepared for change. Habitat change, decline, transition to new vegetation assemblages, monitoring and responding to decline or loss of species, climate change and the impacts of flora and fauna, ecosystems and functionality, the community, urban environments, and increasing temperatures, change in the frequency and intensity of natural disasters, weather events, storms, flooding, storm surges, and heavy rainfall, and policy change, the transition to renewable energy, creating more natural spaces, and creating urban green zones. The overarching aim is to take a more coordinated and strategic approach to mitigating environmental threats and build capacity to adapt to change on a landscape scale. This is a big, complex task. In fragmented landscapes, including urban landscapes, is it possible to undertake landscape scale conservation? Council believes that this is the transformational step needed in protecting and enhancing habitat and mitigating threats. The benefits are clear. However, there are significant hurdles to overcome and so much more we need to understand. So where do we start? We started by creating a high-level plan to connect habitat. This has given us a great base to start from. The Wildlife Connections Plan, adopted by Council in 2018, defined 5 categories: established corridors, those with high ecological value and strong wildlife movement; regional riparian corridors with high ecological value and those identified as significant from a state perspective; coastal foreshore corridors, coastal fringe corridors of mainland and islands; enhancement corridors with sufficient ecological values and linkages with scope for enhancement; and stepping stone corridors, isolated patches of functional connected habitat. Priority actions were set to improve corridor habitat, prevent wildlife deaths, reduce impacts on corridors, and protect corridor habitat. The plan is underpinned by modelling and takes into account attributes including location, environmental values, dominant vegetation types and keystone wildlife values, core habitat linkages, maximum distances between habitat patches, land uses, community uses, and threats and barriers. Our vision: to connect core conservation areas across the city and increase habitat quantity and quality 5 to 10 years into the future and beyond, including our waterways and riparian corridors, to provide a strategic roadmap for council, residents and stakeholders to focus and prioritise decisions, actions and funding, to provide a key driver for council to allocate funding, including from the Environment Levy, leverage funds from external partners and then track return on those investments. Landscape planning needs to be strategic, agile and adopt a long-term view, thinking in tree time, thinking big in time and space. The planning time frame should be decades rather than following an annual or 3 to 5 year planning cycle. Following a similar approach to transport and infrastructure planning, where networks of roads, rail and other transport modes are designed and prioritised according to a hierarchy. Adopting a long-term regional planning approach and building in all of the environmental considerations, not only at the localised site of the infrastructure, but the impacts of that structure at a meta population scale. We are starting with our local government area. To gain the best outcome, we are aiming to create networks of an array of conservation land types based on a hierarchy of importance as functional connections for wildlife movement. Proactively planning threat mitigation rather than waiting for hotspots to appear. A plan this big can only be achieved through habitat acquisition, restoration, and enhancement. Our vision for landscape scale conservation is supported by the Sustainable Planning Act, the principles of the SEQ Ecological Restoration Framework, and Council's Conservation Land Management Strategy. The SPA has been divided into 2 key regions, the primary region and the secondary region. The primary region identifies the critical environmentally valuable habitat within the wildlife corridors. The aim of this layer is to conserve and enhance these high-value habitats. The secondary region identifies the high environmental values for threatened species within and outside the wildlife corridors. The aim of this layer is to maintain and educate. The SPA strengthens our ability to strategically contribute to the goals and actions within the national and regional frameworks, including Australia's Strategy for Nature, the SEQ Natural Resource Management Plan, the SEQ Ecological Restoration Framework, and Queensland Invasive Plants and Animal Strategy. Similarly, the current and future local framework supports a strategic approach. The Redlands 2030 Community Plan, the Corporate Plan, the Natural Environment Policy, the Conservation and Land Management Strategy, the Koala Conservation Strategy, Wildlife Connections Plan, Biosecurity Plan, and Council's most recent Bay and Creeks Plan, along with operational plans. These key instruments align with our goal, protecting and enhancing biodiversity across the landscape, enabling safe movement of fauna and protection of the natural environment. The Wildlife Connections Plan has no statutory effect and concentrates primarily on the non-statutory ways council and the community can enhance wildlife habitat and corridors. The Connections Plan and the Priority Mapping provide a guiding framework for council's environmental planning program and a focus for the Koala Conservation Plan, Biosecurity Plan and Bay and Creeks Plan. Landscape scale integration and consideration of both terrestrial and riparian corridors, including freshwater, estuarine and coastal foreshore environments. We're focused on the outcome. So what were and are the next steps? Our approach was to start by taking a bird's eye or osprey's view to think strategically and beyond small-scale restoration, identify potential areas across Redland's coast and investigate vegetation assemblages, including existing species, estimating carrying capacity, and then developing restoration ecology options to increase that carrying capacity. Then we add in monitoring and analysing movement of wildlife. We develop partnerships with researchers, public and private organisations to create and implement mitigation measures. We monitor and measure the response. Are species returning? Are populations increasing? How is the health of wildlife populations faring? One concept we're keen to invest in is nutritional ecology, beginning with seeds and focusing on local provenance. Council is aiming to apply nutritional ecology principles to undertake targeted seed collection from species and individual trees that have a high identified nutritional value. Seeds can be treated, stored and propagated at Council's dedicated native plant nursery facility. Seed collection, sorting, treatment, storage and propagation is currently undertaken by Council's Community Bush Care program. Harnessing the expertise in the community and our volunteers and working in partnership with expert partners such as universities enables Council to enhance habitat at a landscape scale across Redland's coast. The aim? To build carrying capacity for wildlife sustainably and efficiently. And from here, who knows where we can go? The sky is the limit. Developing a plan for cooling our streets and places, an opportunity to look at urban heat island impacts, looking at significant trees, creating shaded urban and pedestrian landscapes, providing respite from heat, tree management guideline improvements linked to livable communities, urban greening projects, waterway restoration, citizen science, urban sanctuaries, citywide nature-based wildlife threat management and mitigation, maybe even a conservation economy. Thank you for your time.